Hello, I'm Reverend Keith Walter, and this is the story of the Tinker King that was adapted by Robert White from John Carroll's story and is told on Christ the King's Sunday, the last Sunday of the church year. Next Sunday begins Advent as we prepare for the coming of the Christ child. But before that, we finish the story with Christ returning as king from a cross. The Gospel according to John. Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Did you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" And Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." The Gospel of the Lord. The story of the Tinker King. Get comfortable. It's a couple pages long. There was once a king who disliked the ceremonies and trappings of his office. He reluctantly wore a crown and was uncomfortable when forced to sit on the throne. It began the day of his coronation, when they brought him a magnificent ermine robe. "Where did this robe come from?" asked the young man. The courtier replied, "It came from the royal merchant." "Where did this robe come from?" the king repeated. "Why, it came from Persia," replied the baffled courtier. "Where did this robe come from?" the king persisted. Finally, the courtier blurted out, "Majesty, this robe comes from the skins of small animals when they are trapped." Sadly, the king touched the robe and said, "How can I wear such cruelty for a robe?" Another time, a prince brought a pearl of immense value to the king as a gift. "Receive this pearl as a sign of my homage," said the prince. "Why is this pearl so valuable?" asked the king. "Because of its perfect, moon-like shape," said the prince. But the king persisted, asking his question until the flustered prince confessed. "This pearl is valuable because 16 male slaves drowned while trying to retrieve it from the ocean floor." And so, sadly, the king refused the gift, saying, "How can I wear such cruelty for a jewel?" Though he disliked all the trappings of his office, he replaced them only with confusion. He canceled the Christmas feast when he discovered that the food was taken as a tax from the peasants, the middle class of his day and age. But he could not think of any other way to celebrate. He took no steps to change the customs of the kingdom, but was only saddened by them. He seemed to be just floundering about, not knowing what to do next. And the people noticed. The people said he was too sensitive and gentle to be a king. You know what? Finally, he agreed. He wasn't a king. One day, he simply walked away from the palace and never returned. Quickly, a gang of knights, cruel knights, replaced the gentle king. They increased the taxes on the peasantry, and they reveled in the splendor of royalty. And as the taxes rose, the services deteriorated. Roads and bridges were no longer repaired, and sanitary conditions grew worse. Meanwhile, the gentle king became a tinker and traveled about the country sharpening knives and fixing pots. Essential stuff for the peasants, a sharp knife and a working pot. Most of his work was done in the kitchen of those peasants. They loved the little man who listened with his eyes and asked questions with his heart. The tinker and the people learned to love one another. He learned that the people were unhappy. He learned that the taxes of the knights created a terrible burden and that their inept rule made life difficult. The people learned from the tinker that everything is connected to everything else, and that whenever anything dies a little, we all die a lot. What the people did not learn was the nature of his true identity. Although he looked like the former king, no one was certain. Why would a king be working as a tinker? Often people asked him, "Are you the king?" And he normally responded by answering with a question, "Do I look like a king?" One day, the tinker was sharpening knives under a tree at the home of a family whose son had died in the fields while working long hours, trying to earn the monthly tribute tax. When the crowd gathered to talk, as they often did, the tinker asked the father a question. "Who did this to your son?" "The heat did it. The heat killed my son," the man replied, sadly but firmly. The tinker pressed him until he finally cried out, "The knights did this. The cruel knights killed my boy." People quickly quieted the father, telling him that such talk was dangerous. "The truth," said the tinker, "is always dangerous." "What are we to do?" the boy's father pleaded. But the tinker did not reply. "You see connections," he cried. "You make us see connections with your questions. Now that we see, what are we to do? Looking up from the knife that he was sharpening, the tinker said quietly, "The knights have not always ruled in this kingdom. One day they will be removed. How can we fight men with great swords?" a woman in the crowd cried, "when all we have are farming tools?" The tinker stood and faced the crowd. He spoke with a voice that was powerful and clear. "When the time comes, you will not use swords. All that will be needed is stout poles. Begin now to collect them. Stout poles will be all that we need." "Before we collect our poles," a voice shouted, "answer one question. Are you the king?" This time the tinker did not even respond, but with another question at all. No, he simply waved his hand for the people to disperse. They left, and he finished sharpening his knives. A few days later, the tinker stopped by the side of the road near the royal palace to work on his cart. Hearing hoofbeats, he looked up to see a knight riding at him on a giant stallion directly at him. And right at the last second, the knight pulled up and stopped, looming over the tinker. "What are you doing, you old fool?" the knight laughed. "I don't believe we have met," replied the tinker. "I am one of the ruling knights," the man on horseback shouted, giving the tinker a kick that sent the man rolling in the dirt. Then, spying the wet wheel on the cart, he asked, "Are you a tinker?" "I am," the old man said, picking himself up and dusting himself off. "Then you are coming with me," said the knight triumphantly. He tied a rope around the tinker and nearly dragged him into the royal courtyard. "Brothers, noble knights, I have brought a tinker to sharpen our weapons," he declared. "Bring your swords and axes, and the tinker will put a fine edge on our steel." For 3 long days, the tinker sat hunched over his wheel, sharpening the weapons of the cruel rulers. Every blade in the palace was placed against his wheel. When he finished, the swords were so sharp they could cut fine paper. Whoa, sharp. The big knight pushed the tinker out through the city gates and jeered, "We have spared your life. That is what you will be paid, nothing more. You will sharpen our weapons again another day." Quickly, the tinker moved across the plain and up to a nearby village. He called the people together with a shout. No longer did he speak in questions. This time he gave directions. "The time has come. Gather at dawn tomorrow on the plain outside the palace and bring your stout poles." Before the sun rose, all the people of the kingdom assembled near the castle where the cruel knights lived. Each carried a stout pole or a farming tool, very similar to a stout pole. In front of them Standing atop his old cart was the tinker himself. Eventually, the great wooden doors of the castle opened and a crowd of knights emerged. Their swords and armor glistened in the morning light. And as they began to move forward, fear seized the crowd. "Stand tall, my people," the tinker cried. "But we are about to die," they shouted. "No," the tinker insisted. "You are about to live. Do not strike these men, these cruel knights. They are your poorest sons. Only stop their swords with your sticks." No one understood what the tinker meant, but they trusted him. And so they stood firm with their poles held high above their heads. The knights roared with laughter at the sight of the peasants facing them with mere wood. The first knight went straight for the tinker and swung his sword as if to cut through the pole and kill him. Astonishingly, as his sword slashed into the thin wood, instantly, remarkably, the metal withered and collapsed. The blade was gone. The tinker, in sharpening the knight's weapons to such fine edges, had ground away their substance on his wheel. The swords were sharp to the eye and soft to the touch, but when they met the wood, they withered like tissue. One by one, the knights were disarmed. Without a single death, without a single injury, the battle was over. All the people gathered around the old cart and cheered the tinker. One of the older citizens spoke for them all. "Once and for all, please answer the question. Are you a king? We are all asking, are you a king?" The tinker stepped forward and with a voice that was strong and clear said, "I am." Immediately, the crowd broke forth into shouting, "Crown the tinker! Crown the tinker!" Holding up his hands for quiet, the old man addressed his supporters. "I am not a king who will rule over you. I have come not to be served, but to serve. I have come to help you see that everything is connected to everything else. I urge you to choose leaders who love justice and who live humbly and simply." And then he slipped simply away and let them begin a new life without him. In the years ahead, the little kingdom established a government that was just and fair. When people told stories to their children about the early days, they said that their way of life had been shaped by the man who was called the Tinker King. And the people lived joyfully ever after.